Hello, my name's David Cross and I'm a reader in art and design at University of the Arts London. When I began looking at how the practices of picturing influence perceptions of sustainability and resilience, I was focused on climate change as part of the wider ecological crisis. Since then, the crisis has deepened and presents now major new issues with the COVID-19 pandemic. And today there is also an escalating war in Europe with millions of people displaced suddenly, political tensions involving China and turbulence sending shockwaves through the world's stock markets. So the meaning of what I want to show you is changing, but I hope that some of the principles are still relevant. One of these principles is that because meaning is contingent on context, it is important to check the definitions of key concepts and terms. So first, I'd like to briefly describe and relate the two key terms, sustainability and resilience. In 1987, the World Commission on Environment and Development defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is still the most widely used definition of sustainability, and it requires ecological, economic and social issues to be balanced or reconciled within an ethical framework of obligation to other people. To strengthen the association between visual culture and sustainability, I made this version of the conventional Venn diagram, but I softened the hard boundaries of categories by showing them as a layering of additive colour. The red, green and blue light of video, cinema and computer screen display which carries so many of our visual ideas. Since that definition was published, the term sustainability has been so widely used that its meaning has become deeply ambiguous and contested. For example, this image is from the website of Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is a global aerospace and weapons corporation based in the USA. Yesterday, the 14th of March, Germany announced that it will buy 35 US F-35 fighter bomber jets as part of a €100 billion upgrade to the military in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How sustainable is that? If sustainability is a complex and contested term, then so too is resilience. The Stockholm Resilience Centre do brilliant research on coupled ecological and social systems. And they define resilience as the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city or an economy, to deal with change and continue to develop. Fair enough. But they go on to say, it is about how humans and nature can use shocks and disturbances, like a financial crisis or climate change, to spur renewal and innovative thinking. Like sustainability, the concept of resilience has been instrumentalized in the world of business by management consultants promising to improve productivity in corporations. By focusing on personal qualities and team dynamics, resilience shifts responsibility away from employers and onto individuals. The idea that shocks like financial crisis or climate change can be used to spur innovation echoes Naomi Klein's thesis of disaster capitalism, in which powerful people exploit crises to establish controversial policies. Perhaps resilient workers who can cope with precarious employment and the chronic stress of endless competition are less likely to criticise the structural causes of inequality. This photo puts the viewer between two conflicting parties, framing the opposing positions as though they're balanced. The fact that both sides are wearing uniform, gloves and helmets reinforces the idea of equivalence between police and firefighters. But the truncheon is a symbol of coercive force, and using it to suppress calls for social justice signals a potential crisis of legitimacy for the neoliberal state. Jonathan Joseph has argued that the discourse of resilience fits perfectly with neoliberal governmentality, promoting things such as limited government, public-private partnerships, stakeholding, active agency, and bottom-up approaches. Whether we blame the withering of the state or the corresponding accumulation of private capital, it's clear that social resilience is undermined by extreme inequality. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, authors of a book called The Spirit Level, wrote, "Inequality colours our social perceptions. It invokes feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination, which affect the way that we relate to and treat each other." The practices of picturing are common to art and design. Picturing includes framing, representing, and envisioning. Framing refers to how issues are defined and categorized. Representing refers to how visual signs operate within codes. And envisioning refers to how new ideas are proposed through visual forms. So today, I'd like to engage with the problematics of those practices of picturing and apply them to sustainability and resilience. Having outlined the contested nature of our key terms, sustainability and resilience, we can explore them in relation to the methods of picturing. Framing refers to how issues are defined and categorized. The photograph of the Earth from space is a prime example of the ambiguous nature of images. As part of the space race, a symbolic rivalry between competing ideologies of capitalism and communism, NASA's Apollo 8 mission was driven by a gaze that looked outwards to the moon. But one of its most lasting achievements was this historic image looking backwards to the Earth. Briefly, the image seemed to crystallize the hope that humanity could achieve an awareness that the planet and the world are not split from each other but joined as a living, connected system. Yet Wolfgang Sachs has argued that, in this unifying image, all traces of human reality disappear and only the permutations of the biosphere are to be seen. No traditions, no institutions, no history. The world has vanished into the earth. Also in 1968, Buckminster Fuller reframed one of our basic assumptions by proposing that we should see planet Earth as a spaceship, and that as its crew, humanity needs to learn how to maintain its life support system, especially the atmosphere. The philosopher Peter Sloterdijk wrote, "From that critical moment onwards, the good old Earth could no longer be considered some natural variable, but as a huge artificial construct. It was no longer the foundation of things, and instead a vehicle." Mark Fisher wrote a brilliant short book titled Capitalist Realism: Is There No Alternative? In it, Fisher argues for an understanding of capitalist realism as a kind of psychological barrier constraining action by limiting the range of things we might think about and imagine to be possible. Back in 1978, Judith Williamson's book Decoding Advertisements showed how advertisements address us as consumers rather than as citizens. Robert Goldman developed this argument, showing how viewers supply the interpretive labour necessary to assembling sign values, and hence the possibility of surplus values. He shows that advertisers no longer address us as passive consumers of meaning. They invite us to decode advertisements and to combine interpretation with authorship. In this example, the fashion brand Diesel addresses us as viewers who know that consumerism is contributing to climate damage and who feel the conflict between ethical obligations and hedonistic choices. In the Netflix drama series Breaking Bad, Walter White, a chemistry lecturer in the USA, is diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. Without healthcare insurance or support from the state, Walter's diagnosis precipitates a crisis. To pay his hospital bills and provide for his family after his death, Walter sets up a chemistry laboratory in this giant Winnebago motorhome, making top-quality methamphetamine. Gradually, his behaviour transforms from stability and coherence into a double life of contradictory values, and he finds himself split between absolute care for his home and family and complete disregard for the damage he inflicts on his community and society. When police try to seize his drug-making laboratory, they're refused entry on the legal grounds that the Winnebago is not a vehicle, it's a home with wheels on. So framing can be a decisive act of categorization. In this self-portrait by Giuseppe Pennoni, the simple act of wearing mirrored contact lenses challenges the viewer to imagine a social encounter in which both artist and viewer are transfixed by the image of themselves as isolated from each other. In his 1970 book, The Urban Revolution, Henri Lefebvre charts the transformation from the town to the urban society, which he shows to be the ultimate product of industrialization. And he chillingly observes the link between the rise of the commodity form and the emergence of an individualized subjectivity. In our affluent consumer society, we're encouraged to approach problems in isolation from each other and to focus on symptoms rather than causes. In short, to think as private individuals. As a physical manifestation of a problem boundary, flood defences can be vital forms of resilience to extreme weather events. But a more sustainable strategy would be to expand the problem boundary to engage with the whole river valley as an ecosystem. Even then, though, the problem of flooding spills over from land management to connect with climate breakdown. And to solve that problem, we must leave fossil fuels in the ground. This really cannot be addressed by individuals acting independently from each other. What is needed is collective action. John Hilliard's conceptual artwork titled Cause of Death from 1974 is a direct exposition of how cropping and labelling a photograph can transform the meaning of it as an image. Here, a body is shown next to a hole in the stony ground, and the photo is labelled with the word crushed. The same body is now seen to be on a slope by the water's edge. This photo is labelled drowned. Once more, the same body is shown at the foot of a bridge. This photo is labelled fell. And in the final photograph, the body is next to a fire. The photo is labelled burned. The complex critical implications of this work are the result of the simplest of techniques and an economy of form. To say that someone has been framed is to say that they have been wrongly accused of a crime. Framing can direct our understanding to a certain scale, or constrain it to a certain domain. For example, the idea of a carbon footprint implies that we should focus on our personal lifestyle choices as consumers. Carbon literacy training does this. But in a big step away from the personal responsibility of carbon footprinting, people working on climate attribution are tracing carbon emissions to carbon producers. And they're using the term carbon fingerprinting for the practice of identifying corporate liability. Carbon fingerprinting reframes climate change and ecological collapse from the realm of tragedy to the realm of crime. Climate attribution and climate litigation both connect to work led by the international lawyer Polly Higgins for ecocide to be recognised as the 5th international crime against peace. A law against ecocide would hold persons in a position of superior responsibility, such as the heads of fossil fuel corporations, accountable for the actions of their organisations. Rather than just pay a fine from their vast, undertaxed profits, corporate chiefs would get a taste of prison food. From framing, we're going to move on to representing, which refers to how visual signs operate within codes. This image of a giant packet of cigarettes hidden behind the pyramids became one of the most famous advertising campaigns of all time. Tobacco companies developed techniques of disinformation which are still being used today to cover up for the fossil fuel companies. But advertising agencies play with codes and signs to communicate messages with multiple layers of meaning. The link between smoking and cancer has been known since 1955. So rather than deny it, the advertisers associated their distinctive golden cigarette pack with the pyramid, a giant tombstone and symbol of a dead civilization. After years of cutting costs that compromised safety standards, the British petroleum oil rig Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank in April 2010, killing 11 crew and devastating the environment. The photo was taken not by a professional photographer or journalist, but by an oil rig worker who gave the photo away. I think there's a powerful relationship between the disaster which resulted from greed and the image of it which was shared as a gift at a moment of loss. Following the disaster, the branding agency Landor aimed to rebuild trust in British Petroleum, positioning the brand as a key corporate sponsor of the London 2012 Olympics. Here, the image of a Paralympic athlete invokes the human body as a symbol combining imperfection or damage with beauty and determination to succeed. But signs and symbols can also be hijacked and repurposed to oppose the dominance of private corporations. In February 2020, climate activists sneaked a Trojan horse into the grounds of the British Museum, hijacking the new exhibition, Troy, Myth and Reality, to protest against the museum's relationship with BP. The activists said, "We peacefully occupied the building and grounds for 3 days to shine a spotlight on the oil company's impacts around the world, and the ways in which the museum's own history and that of its sponsor were born out of colonialism and empire." In this image, indigenous activists subvert the symbol of the nation-state to argue that climate breakdown and ecological destruction are rooted in the history of colonialism. So it's clear that representation is simultaneously cultural and political. In consumer culture, people are figured as self-interested individuals competing for material advantage. In sharp contrast to that figure, Extinction Rebellion is not offering its members hope of success or material reward. They're demanding action as a moral imperative. And they're not asking for a small contribution to a realistic goal. They're demanding a major sacrifice for a greater ideal. By capturing media attention with carefully staged public spectacles, and by demanding rather than asking for action, they have challenged assumptions about political representation. But XR itself has been criticised for its membership being unrepresentative of the racial and ethnic diversity of British society. After an Extinction Rebellion event in London, which took place before the pandemic, these two women were interviewed by The Guardian, and I was struck by what they said. If this had been anything but Caucasian people, there would have been armed police officers and a big problem. The question of whose point of view, whose interest is represented by a visual image or artifact often goes unasked. But at certain moments, representation itself comes into focus as both a political and cultural practice. So we've looked at framing and representing. Finally, we'll pass on to envisioning, which refers to how ideas are proposed in visual forms. So we could look at some scenarios and how they're used as spaces of imaginative possibility that enable people to produce the future through making choices in the present. Frederick Jameson once wrote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." Painted soon after the French Revolution, this watercolour by Joseph Michael Gandhi uses dramatic composition and lighting in the contemporary traditions of Romanticism to envision the Bank of England at a time in the future when it will lie in ruins. In the 1968 film Planet of the Apes, astronauts return from space to find that time has been dilated and they're far in the future, long after the Earth has been devastated by war. By positioning an icon of visual culture in this imagined future, the scenario invites the viewer to reconfigure the coordinates of possibility. Here, the hypothetical question might be, whose liberty does the statue proclaim now? Sustainability is held to be self-evidently a good thing. But what is it that we want to sustain? And how long do we hope to sustain it? Here, the Sony Corporation invites us to play in The Last of Us, an award-winning survivalist adventure. In this scenario, the industrial society has collapsed and people leave the city behind, making their way towards a position where we, the viewer, are already stationed, which is in a romantic landscape in which nature is already returning. This image envisions a fantasy of the future based on redemption, but its central motif is a broken bridge, which could be read as a sign of the end of the age of fossil fuels, or as a symbol of disconnection. The concept of enlightened doomsaying, catastrophisme éclairé in French, proposed by the French philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, involves imagining a catastrophic future in order to trigger action so that it does not take place. So, is this kind of scenario escapist indulgence or a useful warning? Critics and opponents of the global Occupy movement claimed that it failed because it refused to set out a list of demands. But this poster by the designer Kalle Larsson is somehow both clear and ambiguous. I think its visionary power comes from envisioning social conflict in terms of sensory contrasts, such as between cold bronze and warm flesh, or between the solidity of the figures and the billowing clouds of tear gas behind. The elegant poise of the ballerina subordinates and transcends the brute force and aggression of Wall Street's economic bull. It's good that there are different visions of a more resilient or sustainable future, because that means we don't have to like them all. In response to demands for radical change to save the planet, we're offered a vision of electric vehicles. It's true that we could all breathe cleaner urban air if we got rid of fossil fuel engines. But it's also true that demand for electric vehicles would massively increase mineral extraction for generating and storing renewable electricity. And that would transgress planetary boundaries and compound the injustices of colonialism. As the London mining network has shown, the extraction of minerals for the transition to a post-carbon society continues the long history of colonialism, which enriches people who are already rich, while dispossessing local and indigenous communities and irreversibly damaging fragile ecosystems. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, envisions the future of humanity as a multi-planet species. Taking colonialism to new frontiers, he's using the profits from the Tesla Corporation to fund his SpaceX venture, which aims to establish a private colony for billionaires on Mars. So whereas the 1960s space race was based on a dream of uniting humanity, Musk's vision is based on divisions and inequality. Back to Earth now, and another vision of the future rooted in the space age. For the Eden project in Cornwall, in Britain, the Grimshaw architects practice has built giant geodesic domes in a disused quarry. Enormous polyhedral structures enclose microclimates, each supporting biomes or living environments from around the planet, offering a vision of technology going beyond sustainable design to achieve regenerative design. But this vision of a possible future could be seen as a theme park, offering an encounter with ecological thinking which is bounded by the cafe and gift shop. Why do so many visions of the technological mastery of nature come from the economic domination which is imposed by capitalism? As the planetary ecosystem breaks down from the impacts of the consumer societies, the few remaining places of unspoiled nature become still more precious. This image is from a private property developer seeking investors in a luxury private development in a gated community in Costa Rica. The company's marketing material says, "The Yoko village community is a balanced mix of freelance artists and creators, digital nomads, and creatively inspired entrepreneurs, resulting in a community of like-minded people. The villages were designed to promote a healthy, well-balanced lifestyle while meeting the professional needs of remote workers who are looking to plant roots in paradise." Although this vision of living comfortably in a tropical forest might be superficially appealing, its ecological impact is bound to be high. And in social and cultural terms, I think the project offers a disturbing mix of suburban conformity and settler colonialism. The idea of paradise as somewhere pristine, removed from everyday life, is a part of the separation of nature and culture which has been part of Eurocentric thought since the binary splits of the Enlightenment. But although pure wilderness is a myth, the movement to restore and regenerate biodiverse ecosystems does have a valuable contribution to make. In the Lurs Plateau in China, centuries of overgrazing by animals has damaged the landscape and driven people into poverty. With too little vegetation, steep hillsides suffer from soil erosion, rivers become dried up, and the whole hydrological cycle has failed, turning the land to desert. But by changing land ownership and working with local people to terrace the steep slopes, the erosion has been halted, enabling the large-scale restoration of this damaged ecosystem to begin. Envisioning more sustainable futures involves situating them within different models of the social. The philosopher Peter Hallward, who gave a brilliant lecture in the Lecture Theatre at Chelsea, wrote, "Isolated individuals can do little more than try to fulfil their immediate bodily needs. Socialized individuals acquire the capacity to act independently of such needs and to do what is necessary to transform their collectively created world." Solar World Cinema, based in the Netherlands, has a mission to bring unseen films to unusual places. They run a mobile cinema powered by solar energy in collaboration with the film festival Fi Sahara and the Abidine Qaid Saleh audiovisual school at the Dakhla refugee camp in Algeria. Social systems are completely interconnected with economic systems and the ecological systems which they depend on. And these show that another world is not just possible, it's already available. The vision of fair trade raises the question, why isn't all trade fair? A Dream of a Low-Carbon Future is a wonderful graphic novel that imagines Britain in the year 2150 as a sustainable, prosperous, low-carbon society. It's not a fantasy utopia, but it does envision life beyond the climate and ecological crisis. While most future scenarios warn of the disaster coming, this publication takes on the more difficult and complex task of balancing realism with optimism. The artist James Mackay says, "I'm not thinking of fantasy or sci-fi visions. I'm coming from a photograph of a real place and then trying to work out what it would look like if you had new technologies inserted into that landscape." Andrea Zimmerman is an award-winning filmmaker and artist who's actually a lecturer at CSM. And her films reimagine the relationship between people, place and ecology. I recommend her film Here for Life, which is a kind of collective self-portrait by a community of marginalised people living in London. It's a wonderful vision of a relaxed, low-key way of life based on equitable coexistence and what they've called creative waywardness. It's a very funny and very kind film, so I really recommend you watch it. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine intensifies, citizens in neighbouring countries are working together right now, spontaneously organising to help people who are fleeing the war zone by giving them food, shelter and transport to safety. Faced with a dangerous and turbulent future, what can art, design and the humanities do? Well, my proposal to you today is that the main thing they can do is to envision alternative possibilities and to help people choose from them as an act of free will. Buen vivir, which translates from the Spanish as good living, is the South American search for alternatives to capitalist models of development. Like sustainability and resilience, buen vivir is a hotly contested term in the struggle for social justice, partly because Spanish is the language of the European coloniser of South America. Buen vivir is based on the indigenous vision of sumac causae, which translates as life in plenitude or beautiful life. Sumac causae has forms of knowledge as principles, and these include knowing how to eat, knowing how to drink, knowing how to walk, how to dance, sleep, work, meditate, think, listen, speak, love and be loved, and how to dream. Thanks for listening.